It was one of those tranquil mornings in St. Mary Mead, when everything appeared too perfect to last. The dew still clung to the roses in full bloom, and the faint chime of church bells floated lazily through the air. Miss Jane Marple, in her neat lace cap and soft grey cardigan, sat by her window, knitting a pale blue baby shawl, not for anyone in particular, but one must always be prepared, she liked to say. Her peace, however, was soon to be shattered, and the gossip that followed would make the roses wilt before their time. Lady Bantry had always been the grand presence of St. Mary Mead. Her husband, Colonel Arthur Bantry, had long passed away, leaving her the mistress of Gossington Hall, a stately Georgian manor that seemed to wear its age with grace and gossip alike. Though Lady Bantry had grown somewhat eccentric in her later years, she remained beloved by the village, if not entirely trusted. It was just after 11 when the telephone rang in Miss Marple's sitting-room. She frowned slightly. Calls at that hour were rarely of a social nature. Lifting the receiver delicately, she spoke in her gentle voice. "Yes, this is Miss Marple. Jane, my dear, it's Dolly Bantry." Miss Marple immediately heard the tremor beneath the words. Lady Bantry's tone, usually brisk and commanding, was oddly unsteady. "Dolly, whatever is the matter?" There was a pause, then the words that would stir St. Mary Mead like a spoon in a teacup of scandal. "There's been a death here at Gossington Hall." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "A death?" she repeated softly. "Yes, a man. I don't know who he is, Jane. The police are already here. They say it looks like poisoning." When Miss Marple arrived an hour later, Gossington Hall was in a state of bewildered agitation. Policemen moved briskly about, and the air smelled faintly of lavender polish and apprehension. Lady Bantry stood in the great hall, her pearls trembling slightly against her throat. "Jane, thank heavens you've come," she whispered, gripping her friend's hand. The body had been found in the library of all places, the very room where years ago another corpse had once shocked the Bantry household. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple, who raised a knowing brow. "History," she murmured, "has an unkind way of repeating itself, particularly in old houses." Inside, Inspector Craddock, a capable man of calm demeanour, looked up as she entered. "Miss Marple, fancy seeing you here again," he said dryly. "I do seem to have a knack for arriving where I am least expected," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. The victim was a man of about 40 tall, well dressed, with a faint trace of tobacco on his fingers and the look of someone not accustomed to country living. On the small table beside him was an empty glass, the faint scent of almonds still clinging to its rim. "Cyanide," murmured Craddock grimly. "Quick, brutal, and unmistakable." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And how very curious that such a thing should find its way into Lady Bantry's home." Lady Bantry flushed. "I assure you, Jane, I've never even heard of cyanide outside of novels." "Precisely," Miss Marple said gently. "Which makes one wonder who among your recent guests might have had a more practical acquaintance." The morning unfolded like the slow turning of a page. Names were exchanged, statements given, and whispers grew like ivy. The first of the household to be questioned was Mrs. Ridgway, the formidable housekeeper who had been with the Bantrys for 20 years. She was a woman of stern moral fibre, yet her eyes darted nervously when the subject of the deceased arose. Then there was Mr. George Fenton, a visiting cousin from London, charming, handsome, and always short of money. He had arrived only 2 days prior, claiming to be taking the country air. Miss Alice Graham, Lady Bantry's young companion, pale and quiet, seemed distressed almost to faintness. She had been seen serving drinks the previous evening, including, perhaps, the fatal one. Finally, Dr. Leonard Pritchard, the local physician and long-time friend of both Lady Bantry and Miss Marple, arrived to pronounce the official cause of death. His expression, though professional, betrayed a flicker of unease. "It's a straightforward case of poisoning," he said, closing his black bag, "though how or why I cannot yet say." "Poison," murmured Miss Marple, gazing thoughtfully at the empty glass. "Such a dreadful thing, and yet so very tidy. A murderer's method of choice when appearances must be kept neat." Lady Bantry sighed, clutching a lace handkerchief. "They'll think I had something to do with it, won't they, Jane? A strange man, dead in my library. It looks so dreadfully improper." Miss Marple gave a small, reassuring smile. "People will think what they always think, my dear Dolly, the worst. But don't trouble yourself. I rather imagine the truth will be much stranger and far more revealing." Outside, the village buzzed like a disturbed beehive. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley declared she had always suspected Gossington Hall was due for scandal. At the Blue Boar, the landlord claimed he'd seen the deceased man in the bar only the night before, speaking rather intently to a woman in a dark hat. By dusk, speculation had outpaced fact, and Miss Marple, seated once more by her window, sipped her evening tea thoughtfully. A man dead in Lady Bantry's library poisoned, a handful of likely suspects, and a faint, familiar pattern emerging beneath the surface. "I wonder," she murmured to herself, "if this death has anything to do with that visit Lady Bantry received last week, the one she called a dreadful bore." Her needles clicked softly in the fading light. Somewhere in the village a secret had begun to stir, and Miss Marple, with her quiet, penetrating gaze, was already listening. The following morning dawned grey and drizzling, the kind of weather that makes everything incensed. Merry Mead appeared slightly out of joint. The mist clung to the hedgerows, and the church spire seemed to pierce a sky of pewter. Yet, within her cosy cottage, Miss Marple was entirely undisturbed by the gloom. She had already placed her tea tray neatly on the table, and was deep in thought, her mind turning over the details of the curious affair at Gossington Hall. A stranger poisoned in Lady Bantry's library. No apparent connection, no visible motive, only whispers and fear. It was at that very hour that Inspector Craddock arrived, shaking the rain from his hat. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, though his tone suggested that her assistance, while tolerated, was not officially welcomed. Miss Marple smiled with the patience of a woman long accustomed to underestimation. "You'll find, Inspector," she said mildly, "that the longer one lives in a village, the more one learns about human nature, and murder, unfortunately, is very human indeed." Craddock sighed, setting down his notebook. "We've identified the deceased. Name of Henry Mullins, former business associate of a certain Mr. Fenton, the cousin visiting Lady Bantry." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "How convenient," she murmured. "The countryside does have such a way of attracting London troubles." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Gossington Hall. She arrived just as Lady Bantry was attempting to manage an impossible situation, half her servants whispering, the other half threatening to resign. "Oh, Jane, it's dreadful," Lady Bantry cried, ushering her into the morning room. "They think I've done it. The maid overheard one of the constables saying I'm in the dock. Can you imagine? Me in the dock." "Calm yourself, Dolly," Miss Marple soothed. "You'll not be in any dock unless you insist upon making yourself appear guilty." Lady Bantry blinked, then sighed heavily. "You do have the most comforting way of putting things." Miss Marple gave her friend's hand a small pat. "Now then, I should like to speak to the household only briefly, you understand." Mrs. Ridgway, the housekeeper, was first. She stood stiff as a poker, hands folded before her. "I've told the inspector all I know, ma'am. The gentleman arrived just after 7, asked to see Lady Bantry, said it was urgent. I showed him into the library and went to fetch her ladyship, but she was upstairs dressing for dinner. When she came down, the man had gone, or so we thought. Later, we found him, you know, slumped there. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Did you notice his manner? Nervous, agitated? Mrs. Ridgway hesitated. I'd say anxious, as if he feared someone might follow him. Next came Miss Alice Graham, the companion. She appeared pale and tearful, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. It's so horrible, Miss Marple. I can't get it out of my mind. I made the drinks that evening, the sherry for Lady Bantry, the port for Mr. Fenton, and a whisky for the poor man. I placed them all on the tray myself. Ah, Miss Marple said softly, and where did you pour the whisky from? From the decanter on the sideboard, of course. It's always there. Miss Marple made a small note in her mind, not on paper. Was the bottle recently opened? Alice frowned. I'm not sure. I think Mrs. Ridgway refills it. Indeed, said Miss Marple, that's often how one loses count of what's gone in and what's been added. Finally, Miss Marple sought out Mr. George Fenton, who lounged in the smoking room, looking far too relaxed for a man connected to a murder. My dear Miss Marple, he said with a rakish smile, you can't possibly believe I had anything to do with that unfortunate business. Henry Mullins was a scoundrel, owed money all over London. If anyone poisoned him, it was one of his creditors. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured. Then you knew him well. Fenton hesitated, his smile faltering. We had dealings, nothing important. Yet he came all the way from London to see Lady Bantry. Miss Marple said, that does seem rather significant, doesn't it? Fenton's eyes flickered. Perhaps he wanted money from her, too. He was always begging from the wealthy. Miss Marple left the hall just as the rain stopped, and the evening light began to seep through the clouds. The cobbled path glistened beneath her feet as she walked slowly toward home, her mind knitting together the fragments of the day. A stranger visits Lady Bantry. He knows her name. He insists on seeing her. Within the hour he is dead. A man connected to her cousin, a man with debts, desperation, and perhaps a secret. And then there was the curious matter of the whisky decanter. At the corner of the lane she paused to greet Dr. Pritchard, who was cycling home, still puzzling over our poisoned gentleman. He asked, dismounting with a sigh, Indeed I am. Miss Marple replied, Tell me, doctor, when you examined him, did you notice anything peculiar besides the poison? Pritchard thought for a moment. Yes, now that you mention it, there was a faint mark on his left wrist, like a burn or irritation. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. A burn mark. How interesting. I've often found such things tell a story, if one only knows how to read it. As she returned home, she set the kettle on, her thoughts swirling like steam. Someone had brought death into Gossington Hall, but not by chance. The poison had been meant for someone. The question was, whom? And in that quiet, rain-soaked village, Miss Marple resolved that by the time the truth by the following day, St. Mary Mead was humming with intrigue like a beehive prodded with a stick. The grocer's wife was quite certain Lady Bantry had been carrying on with that poor dead man, while Mrs. Price Ridley swore she'd seen a strange woman loitering near the gates of Gossington Hall that very afternoon. In a village where secrets were currency, gossip was gold, and business was flourishing. Miss Marple, however, was not one for idle chatter. She preferred her facts those quiet, overlooked little things that told far more truth than the noisiest rumours. After luncheon she made her way once more to Gossington Hall, a neat bundle of knitting under her arm, which was always her excuse for appearing where she wished to observe. Lady Bantry, looking tired but defiant, was waiting for her in the drawing-room. "They've taken to calling me the widow of Gossington Hall in the village," she said bitterly. "I swear, Jane, if one more person gives me a sympathetic glance, I shall scream." "Then don't give them the satisfaction, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Hold your head up and let them wonder instead." She sat, pulling a few stitches of her knitting, her eyes moving with quiet calculation about the room. "Tell me, Dolly, this gentleman, Mr. Mullins, did you ever meet him before that night?" "Never," Lady Bantry declared. "Though he did mention my late husband's name once, I think. Something about an investment gone wrong years ago." "Ah," murmured Miss Marple, "so the past casts its shadow again." While Lady Bantry went to take a call, Miss Marple wandered quietly through to the library. It was a sombre room now, the air faintly musty, the scent of polish unable to mask the ghost of death. She examined the decanter on the sideboard. It was full again, freshly topped up. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with interest. That was curious indeed. One would expect it to have been removed by the police as evidence. She stooped slightly, noticing a faint ring on the wood where another glass had once stood slightly apart from the others. And beneath the table, tucked between the carpet and the leg, was a tiny scrap of folded paper. Carefully she retrieved it. It appeared to be a torn portion of a letter written in a man's hand. The visible words read, "If she discovers what we did at the club, we're both ruined. Destroy it, all of it." Miss Marple's lips curved in a small, grim smile. "Oh dear," she murmured, "that sounds very much like a motive." At that very moment Inspector Craddock entered. "Still snooping, Miss Marple?" he asked dryly. "Not snooping, Inspector, observing," she replied, tucking the note delicately into her knitting bag. "You might say I'm preserving the evidence of human folly." Craddock sighed. "We've been chasing down this Mullins fellow's background. Seems he ran a dubious investment club in London, lost a good deal of money for people who could ill afford it. There's a rumour he was blackmailing one of his clients." Miss Marple gave a gentle, knowing nod. "Blackmail? It's a dreadfully untidy crime, Inspector. One never knows when the tables might turn." That evening she received an unexpected visitor, Dr. Leonard Pritchard. He looked pale and uneasy as he stood in her parlour, his hat twisting in his hands. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I thought you should know the analysis of the whisky bottle came back. There was no cyanide in it at all." Miss Marple looked up from her teacup, eyes bright. "No cyanide?" "None, which means the poison wasn't in the decanter. It must have been added directly to the glass after it was poured." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, her mind turning rapidly, "that does change things. Only those present when the drink was served could have done it." "Doctor?" Pritchard nodded. "Lady Bantry, her companion Miss Graham, and her cousin Fenton, that's all." "Yes," murmured Miss Marple, "3 people, and only 1 drink was poisoned." The doctor hesitated. "There's something else. Mullins had a blister on his wrist, likely from a cigarette burn. Old, but deliberate. Someone may have wanted to hurt him or mark him, or remind him," Miss Marple added quietly, "of something he'd done." The next morning brought a new disturbance. The maid, a nervous young girl named Clara, burst into the kitchen shrieking that she'd seen someone prowling in the garden at dawn. Inspector Craddock was summoned, but by the time he arrived, the intruder had vanished, leaving behind a single clue, a woman's black glove near the rose bushes. "Good gracious!" Lady Bantry exclaimed when she saw it. "That isn't mine, I assure you." Miss Marple examined it closely. The glove was fine leather, faintly scented with violet perfume, the sort used by women of refinement. "How curious," she murmured. "One glove left behind like a calling card." She looked meaningfully at Lady Bantry's young companion. "Tell me, Miss Graham, do you wear perfume?" Alice blushed deeply. "I? Occasionally, yes, but not that sort. "I haven't been near the garden at all." "Of course not," said Miss Marple gently. "It was merely a question." But in her mind another pattern began to take shape, one of deception and fear. A torn letter, a burned wrist, a single poisoned drink, and now a glove scented with violet. Someone had lured Henry Mullins to Gossington Hall for a purpose, and when that purpose was fulfilled, they had silenced him. But who among the household had the nerve and the knowledge to use cyanide so cleverly? As dusk fell once more over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat alone by her fire, knitting untouched in her lap. Her eyes, sharp and blue as winter frost, stared into the flames. "There's something everyone's overlooked," she murmured, "something so simple it's almost laughable. They're all asking who poisoned the man." She leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "When the real question is who was meant to be poisoned." The next morning broke with the clarity that often follows confusion. The mists had lifted from St. Mary Mead, and a crisp autumn sun glimmered on the hedgerows. Yet within Gossington Hall shadows lingered, not of weather but of guilt. Lady Bantry had scarcely slept. Her face was drawn, her usual vitality dimmed by fear and indignation. "Jane," she whispered as Miss Marple entered, "they're saying now that I was the one meant to drink that whisky. Imagine that I was the intended victim." Miss Marple removed her gloves with careful precision. "Oh, but I can imagine it quite well, Dolly. Indeed, I rather believe it's the truth." Lady Bantry gasped. "You can't mean—" "Hush!" Miss Marple interrupted softly. "Let me explain. The more I consider, the clearer it becomes that Henry Mullins' death was an accident of substitution. The poisoned glass was meant for someone else, someone who habitually drinks whisky before dinner. You, my dear." Lady Bantry's hand flew to her mouth. "But why? Who would want to harm me?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is the question we shall presently answer." Inspector Craddock arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by Miss Marple's polite but firm note. "You've discovered something, Miss Marple?" he asked, notebook ready. "I believe so, Inspector," she replied, "but it must be demonstrated, for words alone will not suffice. Kindly have everyone assembled in the library." Within minutes the main suspects stood gathered beneath the sombre portrait of the late Colonel Bantry. The atmosphere was thick with unease. Mrs. Ridgway, the rigid housekeeper, stood tight-lipped by the fireplace. Dr. Pritchard leaned against the mantel, anxious and wary. Mr. Fenton, as always, attempted nonchalance, though his eyes flickered nervously. Miss Alice Graham, pale as paper, clutched a handkerchief in trembling hands. And finally, Lady Bantry, whose composure wavered between outrage and curiosity. Miss Marple stepped forward, her gentle voice commanding more attention than any shout. "When a murder appears senseless, Inspector, it is usually because we have mistaken its purpose. The deceased, Henry Mullins, was not the intended victim. He was, quite simply, in the wrong place at the wrong time and drinking the wrong glass." Fenton scoffed lightly. "That's a far-fetched notion, Miss Marple, is it?" she asked mildly. "You, Mr. Fenton, know quite well that Lady Bantry takes a single glass of whisky before dinner. It's been her custom for years. Yet that evening it was you who offered to pour the drinks. Miss Graham, you carried the tray, yes, but Mr. Fenton was standing beside you, was he not?" Alice nodded faintly. "Yes, he insisted on helping." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Quite so. And when the visitor Mr. Mullins arrived unexpectedly, Mr. Fenton handed him the whisky meant for Lady Bantry." Fenton's expression hardened. "That's nonsense. How could I know which glass was hers?" "Because you prepared it specially," Miss Marple said softly. "The decanter contained no poison, as Dr. Pritchard confirmed. The cyanide must have been added to one glass by someone with a steady hand and a clear intention. You poured it while pretending to be attentive to your hostess. The room fell silent. The only sound was the faint tick of the mantel clock. Miss Marple continued, her tone almost sorrowful. You owed Henry Mullins a great deal of money, did you not? He was threatening to expose you and worse, to reveal that you'd forged Colonel Bantry's signature years ago in an investment scheme. Lady Bantry might have discovered the fraud at any time. You came here to persuade her not to look too closely and to remove the one person who could betray you. Fenton's face blanched. Rubbish, he burst out. You've no proof. Oh, but there is proof, Miss Marple replied, withdrawing the torn letter from her knitting bag. I found this beneath the library table. The handwriting matches your own. Inspector Craddock has already confirmed it. Fenton's mouth opened, but no sound came. And then there is the glove. Miss Marple went on gently. It was not Miss Graham's at all, as you well knew. It belonged to your late wife, a sentimental token you kept, perfumed as she once did. When you went out that night to hide the bottle, you dropped it in your haste. The glove will bear your fingerprints. A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Ridgway clutched her apron. Lady Bantry stared in frozen disbelief. Miss Marple turned back to the inspector. It was all quite logical, really. Mr. Fenton planned to poison Lady Bantry to prevent her from discovering his crimes. But when Mullins appeared blackmailing him, threatening exposure, Fenton panicked. Mullins took the drink intended for Lady Bantry, and the plan unravelled. Craddock stepped forward grimly. George Fenton, I'm afraid that's the end of it. For a long moment Fenton said nothing. Then, with a bitter laugh, he dropped into the nearest chair. You've an extraordinary mind, Miss Marple, he said hoarsely. If I hadn't known better, I'd swear you've done this before. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Oh, only in my little way, she said. One learns a good deal from village life: ambition, deceit, jealousy. The motives are the same everywhere, merely dressed in finer clothes. As Fenton was led away, Lady Bantry sank into a chair, trembling. Jane, I can hardly believe it. All that time I thought I was merely entertaining family. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Family, my dear, can be the most dangerous guests of all. She patted her friend's hand. Now, I should think a nice cup of tea would be the best prescription. And perhaps, Dolly, you might consider switching to sherry for a while. Whiskey seems to have caused quite enough trouble. Lady Bantry gave a weak laugh through her tears. Oh, Jane, how you do manage to make murder sound like a matter for the tea-table. Miss Marple's expression softened. Well, my dear, life even with murder is seldom more than a matter of human weakness, and a little wisdom, properly applied, can set it right again. The following week, peace seemed to have tiptoed cautiously back into St. Mary Mead. The scandal that had so electrified the village began to soften into anecdote, and the local tongues that once wagged like metronomes now merely fluttered with speculation. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley declared that she had always suspected that cousin of Lady Bantry's. Mrs. Hartnell nodded sagely, as though she'd known it from the start. And Miss Weatherby, the vicar's sister, opined that it was the kind of thing that happens when people drink spirits before dinner. Such was village justice delivered over letters and lozenges, with no shortage of self-satisfaction. At Gossington Hall the mood was quieter, more subdued. The great house had regained its stately calm, though Lady Bantry's laughter had lost a little of its usual brightness. She sat in the morning room, surrounded by flowers, a gesture from the villagers, though not all entirely sincere. Miss Marple sat opposite her, pouring tea with delicate precision. You know, Dolly, she said mildly, this entire affair reminds me most strongly of the case of Mr. Hargreaves and his cherry brandy. Lady Bantry groaned. Oh, Jane, not another one of your analogies, just a brief one, Miss Marple promised, smiling. Mr. Hargreaves was a most respectable gentleman who accidentally poisoned himself because he'd taken to decanting his home remedies into the wrong bottles. It caused quite a stir, you know, but it taught one a valuable lesson that even the most innocent of habits can have fatal consequences. Lady Bantry sighed. I suppose my innocent habit was offering whisky to guests without suspicion. Oh no, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, your true habit was trusting those you oughtn't. It's a common weakness, and one I fear not even age cures. Inspector Craddock called that afternoon to deliver the final details. Fenton's confessed, he said. Said Mullins came down to blackmail him for the forgery, and when he realized Lady Bantry was about to discover it too, he decided to act. He never intended to kill Mullins. That part was, as you said, chance. Still, the law doesn't much care for the distinction. Miss Marple nodded solemnly. No, Inspector, the law is rather like village gossip in that regard. Both are far more concerned with outcomes than intentions. Craddock allowed himself a small smile. You know, Miss Marple, you make my job both easier and infinitely more humbling. She chuckled softly. Well, I should hope to be of use, Inspector. After all, one must apply one's experience where it may serve. I dare say knitting and murder have something in common. Both require careful pattern recognition. Craddock laughed outright at that, tipping his hat. I'll remember that next time we have a tangle. When he had gone, Miss Marple lingered a while at Gossington Hall. She wandered through the now peaceful library, that same room where so much horror had unfolded. The faint scent of polish and parchment hung in the air. The curtains fluttered gently, as though the house itself were breathing again after holding its breath. She gazed at the empty armchair by the fire, the one where Henry Mullins had met his untimely end. Then, with a sigh of quiet reflection, she murmured, There is always some small mercy in tragedy, even when unintended. His death, dreadful though it was, spared Dolly from hers. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where the kettle was already singing its little domestic tune. She sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, and watched the sunset spill gold across the village rooftops. Her mind, ever sharp, turned over the patterns of the case, how greed, fear, and pride had converged beneath the calm surface of village gentility. Yet, in the end, the truth had triumphed as it so often did, not through force or fury, but through quiet observation and a clear eye for human frailty. She thought of Lady Bantry, once again free from suspicion, though perhaps forever altered. She'll be stronger for it, Miss Marple murmured softly, though I expect she'll never serve whisky again. A small smile played on her lips as she picked up her knitting needles. It's always the small things, she said to herself, that tell one the most. A misplaced glove, a burned wrist, a glass set just an inch apart. Human beings do so many little things without thinking, and in those tiny gestures one can see the whole truth of a soul. The clock ticked gently in the background. Outside, the evening star appeared over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, content in her quiet certainty, sipped her tea and resumed her knitting. The yarn slipped smoothly through her fingers, one stitch after another, as neat and inevitable as the solving of a mystery. And as the firelight danced on her face, she smiled that serene, knowing smile that came only to those who had looked deeply into the tangle of human hearts, and found, in all their failings, a peculiar kind of grace.